The 2-year-old baby keeps pointing at his father's coffin. What happens next is truly shocking. Hello, everyone. Sit back, take a deep breath, and brace yourself for what you're about to hear, because this story will send shivers down your spine. The grand halls of St. Michael's Church were drenched in sorrow. A heavy atmosphere of grief hung in the air, suffocating those who had gathered. The old church bells tolled, their deep, mournful chimes blending seamlessly with the quiet sobs of the grieving, creating an eerie and heart-wrenching melody that settled over the mourners like a dense fog. At the very front, beside a polished wooden coffin, stood Clara, her posture rigid yet fragile. Her fingers clung tightly to little Lucy, her 2-year-old daughter, who was struggling in her grasp. Lucy's tiny body trembled, her face streaked with tears, flushed red from crying endlessly. Every attempt Clara made to soothe her only seemed to agitate the child further. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, Lucy's teary eyes locked onto the coffin, where her father, Samuel, lay in eternal stillness. "Papa, Papa." The child's broken sobs echoed through the church, her small fingers shaking as she pointed directly at the coffin. Clara swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat as she clutched the black mourning veil draped over her shoulders. She wanted to cry, to scream, to let the unbearable weight of grief break free from within her. But she couldn't. The pain was too raw, too unreal. Just yesterday, Samuel had kissed her goodbye before stepping out of the house, and now, all that remained of him was a lifeless, cold body inside that coffin. Around her, whispers slithered through the gathering like a quiet storm. Villagers murmured, exchanging uneasy glances. No one could comprehend how a strong, healthy man like Samuel had suddenly perished. Some whispered of an accident. Others, in hushed voices, murmured about fate, or something far more sinister. Amid the mourners, an elderly woman, Madame Rose, a respected figure in the village, stepped closer to Clara, her wrinkled hand resting gently on her shoulder. Her eyes, clouded with wisdom and sorrow, studied Lucy carefully before she spoke in a hushed, yet firm voice. "My dear, I know your pain is deep, but little Lucy, are you certain she's all right?" Clara's gaze dropped to her daughter. And then she saw it. Lucy's small frame was trembling, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. But it wasn't grief alone that consumed her. No, her wide, terrified eyes were no longer fixed on the coffin. She was staring unmoving at the darkened corner of the church. And then, without warning, the child let out a piercing, bone-chilling scream. "Papa is trapped. He's calling for help." A cold shiver spread through the crowd like wildfire. Gasps filled the air, and the atmosphere shifted, thickening with something unspoken yet undeniably real. Murmurs erupted once more, nervous glances darting from one mourner to another. Some made the sign of the cross. Others instinctively stepped back, as if distancing themselves from an unseen force. Madame Rose stiffened, her breath hitching as she took a step back. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "The child she can see." Clara felt her entire body go cold. Her heart pounded against her ribcage, every beat growing heavier with dread. Desperate to keep her voice steady, she crouched to Lucy's level, gently grasping the child's shoulders. "Lucy, sweetheart, what did you just say?" The little girl didn't blink. Her tiny hand still pointed to the shadowed corner. Her voice, though small, was clear as day. "Papa's there, Mama. He's calling for help. He's trapped." A sudden gust of wind rushed through the church, causing the altar candles to flicker violently. The light dimmed for a brief moment, plunging the space into an unsettling semi-darkness. A suffocating silence settled over the mourners. And then, the heavy church doors groaned as they slowly creaked open. All eyes snapped toward the entrance. A tall figure stepped inside. Henry, Samuel's cousin, dressed in an impeccable black suit, his broad shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. His dark eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on Clara before he approached with slow, deliberate steps. Clara braced herself as he neared, offering her a practiced, sympathetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Clara, you must be exhausted," Henry murmured, his deep voice deceptively smooth. "We're all heartbroken over Samuel's passing. It's a terrible loss." She barely nodded, her body rigid with an emotion she couldn't quite place. Henry's gaze flickered toward Lucy, who clung to her mother's dress, still staring at the ominous shadowed corner. His smile tightened ever so slightly. "The little one, she's too young to understand. Best not to let her speak of such things. It might unsettle the others," he said, his tone carrying an underlying sharpness. Clara frowned. A cold sense of unease crept up her spine. "She's grieving for her father," she replied firmly, unwilling to entertain his dismissal. Henry exhaled, rubbing his chin before his expression shifted. And then he said something that sent Clara's stomach twisting into knots. "Clara, I hate to bring this up now, but Samuel left behind a significant amount of debt. The house, it might be wise to consider selling it to settle things." Clara froze. A wave of dizziness washed over her. "Sell the house?" Her voice barely came out. "What are you talking about, Henry?" Henry sighed, feigning concern. "Samuel was a good man, but he had his struggles. I'm only thinking about what's best for you and Lucy." A deep, sinking dread took hold of Clara's heart. She had never trusted Henry. And now, here he was, speaking of debts and money, while her husband's body still lay before them. It felt wrong. Lucy suddenly tightened her grip on her mother's hand. Her lips quivered. And then she spoke again. "Papa's trapped," she whispered. Henry's head snapped toward her, his entire body stiffening. For a brief moment, his composed facade wavered. His jaw clenched. His hands balled into fists. The air inside the church thickened. The mourners began inching away, their faces pale with fear. Clara's pulse hammered in her ears. Something wasn't right. She could feel it. A 2-year-old keeps pointing at her father's coffin. What happens next will leave you speechless. The tension in the dimly lit St. Michael's Church was thick, almost suffocating. Muffled sobs and hushed whispers filled the sacred space, blending with the flickering candlelight that cast eerie shadows across the stone walls. Clara stood motionless beside her husband's coffin, gripping her 2-year-old daughter, Lucy, tightly in her arms. The child, usually so full of life, trembled against her mother, her small fingers clutching desperately at the fabric of Clara's mourning dress. Henry, Samuel's cousin, loomed beside them, his voice disturbingly calm despite the grim occasion. "Clara, we need to handle Samuel's affairs, the house, the assets. We must settle everything before it's too late. If Samuel were here, he would want you to take care of things quickly, wouldn't he?" Clara's stomach twisted painfully. She had barely even processed her husband's death, and already Henry was circling like a vulture. His tone, though laced with concern, carried an underlying pressure that unsettled her deeply. "Can you leave me alone for a moment?" Clara asked, her voice steadier than she felt. For a brief second, Henry's expression flickered. Annoyance? Frustration, before he masked it with a forced, thin-lipped smile. "I'm only trying to help," he said, though the sharp edge in his voice suggested otherwise. Then, in a low, almost warning tone, he added, "But if you refuse to listen, I may have no choice but to involve the law." An icy chill crept down Clara's spine. His words weren't just a suggestion. They were a threat. A few feet away, Margaret, a woman from the village, clicked her tongue in disapproval. She leaned toward another mourner and whispered, "Absolutely heartless. The man hasn't even been buried yet, and he's already talking about money?" But Henry didn't seem to care about the murmurs rippling through the crowd. With a casual shrug, he adjusted his black suit and said, "I'll be back tomorrow. Hopefully by then, you'll have thought things through." And with that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the church, his heavy footsteps echoing against the stone floor. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding, not just from his veiled threat but from something far more disturbing. The way he had reacted when Lucy mentioned her father. Why had he looked so tense? She looked down at her daughter. Lucy, still clinging to her dress, was staring unblinkingly at the coffin. Her voice, barely above a whisper, carried through the silent church. Mama, Papa is still here. Clara inhaled sharply. A chill wrapped around her like a second skin. Lucy, what do you mean? She asked, forcing herself to keep calm. Lucy's big, tear-filled eyes met hers. Papa's trapped, she whispered. He's calling me. He's scared. Clara's blood ran cold. A sickening dread spread through her chest as she turned her gaze toward the coffin, solid oak, lids sealed tightly. It was impossible, wasn't it? Beside her, Madame Rose, the elderly village woman, shook her head solemnly. Her voice was barely audible as she murmured, "The child isn't making this up. I've seen this before." Clara whipped her head toward her, heart hammering. What do you mean? For a moment, Madame Rose hesitated, her expression haunted. Then, in a hushed tone, she said, "Many years ago, something like this happened. A man was believed to be dead, but he had only fallen into a deep coma. They buried him, only for his family to suffer nightmares, terrible nightmares, until they finally," she trailed off, her lips pressing into a thin line. A wave of nausea hit Clara. She turned back to the coffin, a horror she couldn't explain creeping into her mind. Lucy hiccuped, gripping her mother's hand tightly, and whispered again, "Papa is calling me." Clara's chest tightened.
No, it couldn't be.
Samuel was gone, wasn't he? Outside, the wind howled against the stained-glass windows, a ghostly wail that sent shivers through the crowd. The flickering altar candles trembled, and then, as if responding to Lucy's words, one of them went out. A ripple of unease swept through the mourners. A middle-aged woman crossed herself and muttered, "This is a bad omen." Clara swallowed hard. What should she do? Her heart pounded in her ears as she felt the weight of every gaze in the church pressing down on her. No, it had to be a coincidence. It had to be. But what if it wasn't? Margaret stepped closer and whispered, "Clara, if you have even the slightest doubt, do not let them bury Samuel just yet." The words hit Clara like a hammer to the chest. She wanted to believe Lucy was just a grieving child speaking nonsense, but deep down, something gnawed at her. A feeling she couldn't shake. Henry had left, but his reaction when Lucy spoke of her father haunted her more than she cared to admit. His entire demeanor had changed. Was it fear? Guilt? Something was off. Madame Rose suddenly reached for Clara's sleeve, her voice low and serious. "My dear, sometimes children can see what we cannot." Clara looked down at Lucy. Her daughter's tiny hands clutched her dress, trembling. "Mama, Papa is scared." A bone-chilling cold washed over Clara, seeping into her very bones.
No.
No, it wasn't possible. Samuel was dead. But what if he wasn't? Her breath quickened, her fingers tightening around Lucy protectively. She felt as though the walls of the church were closing in around her, the weight of uncertainty crushing her. Suddenly, "Clara!" A voice rang out from the entrance, sharp and urgent. She spun around, eyes widening. Standing in the doorway was Matthew, one of Samuel's closest friends. His face was pale, his breath uneven as if he had been running. His expression sent another wave of fear through Clara's body. "I just heard," he panted. "I got here late, but there's something you need to know." Clara's heartbeat thundered against her ribs. What could be so important? Matthew strode toward her, lowering his voice. Before he died, he mentioned something. Something strange. And Clara, it has to do with Henry. Clara stiffened. Henry. The very name sent a fresh jolt of unease through her. Her lips parted, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me." Matthew's gaze darted around, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then, leaning in, he murmured, "A few days before Samuel passed, he told me Henry kept